Welcome to the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Brian Russell, and today it's my privilege to welcome back to the show Joshua Bertolotti. Joshua is a reader, he's a writer, he's the host of In Search of Wisdom podcast, and he's the founder of the Perennial Leader Project. You can find links to all of his materials in the show notes. But Joshua is a bit of what I would call a Renaissance person. He's pulled together and integrated his deep Christian faith with the best thinking and writing that's come out of the wisdom tradition of the ancient world into the modern phase. Now today, it's a real treat because one of Joshua's deep loves and one of his influences is the American Christian contemplative Thomas Merton. And we're going to take a deep dive into how Merton's thought has influenced Joshua and some of the takeaways that we can bring into our own lives from Merton. We have a wide-ranging conversation. We also get into Joshua's second favorite author, Seneca, a little bit. So those of you who enjoy Stoicism are going to appreciate this episode as well. Before I jump into the interview, I want to remind you that if you're interested in connecting with me, you can sign up for materials at brianrussellphd.com. Now let's listen in on the conversation I had with Joshua. Welcome back to the podcast, Josh. It's great to have you on again.
Hey, appreciate it. Glad to be here.
And we're going to talk about Merton and maybe even a little Stoicism. We'll see how that goes. But just talk a little bit about how you, as you have your Perennial Wisdom Project with the whole Perennial Leadership podcast and Search of Wisdom, all those kind of things. So what drew you and what continues to draw you to Thomas Merton and his writings about really the contemplative life?
Oh, I appreciate it. I'm really excited to have a conversation about Merton. As I just mentioned before we hit record, I think Merton and Seneca are two figures that I've been with for a number of years and people I read regularly. And I think I first found Merton. My wife and I have been together for about 20 years or so, and I was not Catholic. My wife is Catholic. So before we got married, I went through the process to become Catholic and really got into it and read a lot of the, halfway modern Catholic authors, people like Thomas Keaton, Merton, Richard Rohr, people like that. And Merton is someone I just have always felt gets a bit like a couple layers beneath the surface in the way of deep wisdom. There's some of these things which are valuable and useful that you might call practical wisdom. And then there's some of these things that are a bit beneath the surface that, touch on things that are a bit more difficult to understand, things like contemplation, love, solitude, things like that. But I've been a longtime fan and student of Merton.
And let's just unpack a couple of things you just said, and let's just even start with something like solitude and silence. How have Merton's writings helped you with that, and how does that connect back to just wisdom, which I know you're so interested in?
Yeah. So some of these things, in a way, are like, to me, it's paradoxical in a way. Of if I think back to about maybe 15 years ago or so, I'm coming up on 45 now. And you get into this and you think of maybe solitude, and oftentimes as people are talking about maybe meditation today as some place of rest and relaxation, and maybe it can be. But he also, points out that contemplation and solitude don't necessarily expect, some tranquility. Contemplating some of these difficult questions can really bring about, it gets you into this area of uncertainty, I guess, to put it broadly speaking, which can bring about some anxiety, some doubt. And, you, someone that is, written and spoke a lot about stillness and contemplative practices, obviously have highlighted that as well. Um, but I think some of that paradoxical wisdom, if you will, the counterintuitive nature of some of these things is really important, because if someone doesn't know that and then they go embark on some sort of stillness practice and then find themselves in some rocky waters, if you will, it's just important to know that what is really possible, and to know that some of that is, in a way, a good sign.
No, that was good. Did you know? I mean, before you started reading the contemplative writers and read Merton, had you already experienced some of that doubt, uncertainty, or was that kind of a primer that made it easier for you to spend more time in contemplation?
Yeah, I think I've always been a bit on the curious side. I mentioned last time we connected, at my first base when I was in the military, there was a young man that took his own life, and it was so shocking to me. I had just never experienced that or seen that, and I didn't know him super well, but looking from afar, seemed to just have everything going for him, everything together. So it brought about a lot of questions. I would consider myself, I've always been a Christian, a believer, but until I met my wife, and until probably late 20s, is when I became much more serious about it, and where my curiosity questions maybe shifted from human nature to more spiritual related questions.
It's good. And have you found in your own spiritual growth, um, so you've read deeply from, I mean, basically the sources themselves that have built up Western civilization. And you just, when you're saying, like, I know lots of people that convert to Catholicism, but I don't know lots of people start reading all the books that you just started rattling off. So you took it really seriously. And at some level, there's always a balance. Theology can give the illusion that we can explain everything about God, and so we have all these deep doctrines. And then what you just said about contemplation. So how do you think, as far as there's certain about a certainty having a foundation in religion. So how does uncertainty help us with certainty, and how does certainty help us with uncertainty? That's even a fair question.
Yeah.
There's your paradox for you.
I think it is a fair question, and it's such an important question. And it's an intimidating question, to be honest, to talk about it, at least for me. But that's a lot of what Merton is talking about as I read New Seeds of Contemplation and things like that. Like, in a way, there's things that say we have certainty about. Like, I feel certain that we're called to love one another.
Yes.
Now, there's can be uncertainty about many things of what should that look like? What does that look like? Though, I mean, you could go on and on, and we have to navigate that uncertainty and do the best we can. But in the way of like contemplation, like Merton says that it's essentially not something that can really be talked about. It's essentially beyond art, poetry. It's not philosophy. It's not, many of these things. And I've had, as you've been a guest on In Search of Wisdom. I've asked many people to maybe differentiate the difference between meditation and contemplation, in even people from Eastern traditions. How do we differentiate these two. But long story short, though, like I was thinking of a particular experience. Like he says, it's in many ways something has to be experienced.
Mm-hmm.
So, like for example, I do a fair amount of walking meditation, and for any listeners out there, in terms of like say walking meditation, no different than sitting meditation. You could use a few different things, maybe commonly, the breath in centering prayer, this prayer word to bring you back. But there's also like the senses, say, so sometimes you could, and I would encourage anybody listening to maybe try this if they haven't, of focus on a particular sense, like say a sound. You're on a walking meditation, and let the focus be the sound. And as you get started, maybe those sounds are subtle, but in my experience, and I think many other people would experience something similar, that as you go, those sounds are gonna become more distinct and louder. You can walk and you can experience all the birds and the insects, things that you were not even aware in the way of the sounds, just from the thoughts that might be going in our head and just the noise of everyday life. You can really experience that. And I think the same thing in terms of senses of like the breeze, even on a day that is very, very calm, on this walking meditation, as you continue, you'll really notice, and be able to experience like the breeze. And on this long thing, and I think that applies to many other things, is my point of the love of God, the love of, from other people, the love that we have for other people. I think of Merton. There's a story of him on the corner of this street, experiencing the love for the people. And I think in a way, like some of that thing of tuning in to the noises of nature that maybe we didn't notice, the same thing can apply to some of these other things. If we can actually tune in in a way, experience the love that we have for others, or vice versa, in terms of receiving, um, might be, the best way that I could come up with in terms of talking about contemplation as this experiential thing.
No, I love that. I want to just drill down a little bit on your practice. So just to make it clear, I was just kind of reading between the lines there. So like when you go out for a walk, I mean, you mentioned wind, you mentioned sounds. I guess you could even use a sight if you saw something and just kind of focus on maybe a rabbit or something if you see it off in the distance, or a tree. So when you hear a sound, like you're saying, oh, I hear a bird, are you trying literally to just that's your focus point? So when you're in that, and that's what's drawing you present, and when you find yourself distracted, you go try to listen for that bird singing again. Is that?
Yeah, I'm using it like an anchor, just like the breath, where I'm
Yeah,
coming
yeah,
back to
yeah.
the present. So I'm not necessarily holding on to, just like a breath, I'm not necessarily holding on to this one. It's this, then that, and then that.
Gotcha.
Um, but it's a real interesting thing of the fact when we turn our present moment attention to something where there's things going on that we're just simply not always aware of. And sometimes even obviously depending on where you're doing it, but the sight can sometimes be a distraction, because you mentioned like the rabbit and things like that. Yeah, the cars and distraction. It's, if you're at a place where you can maybe look down or close your eyes periodically to just have this the sounds coming in, or the sensations of the breeze or whatever it may be.
And you feel that connection. So like when you talk about it helps you in the area of like, let's say, love. Now, a lot of times when we think about contemplation, the first thing that most people think of is some kind of contemplative prayer where we have just an ineffable experience of the divine, kind of a union, if you will. And again, I'm not going to try to use careful theological language because it's kind of beyond description there. But in a sense, also it expands our ability, it seems like, to love others. And how do you think that actually works out? It's like what's the connection between kind of getting tuned in? I think that was maybe a phrase that you used, or and expanding in our capacity to love others.
Yeah, it's a bit of a difficult question for me. Sometimes I think about some of these practices in the way of nothing to do, nothing to, like, no sort of like good or bad. Like, of you can hear people say, and I'm sure I've said that, oh, I'm a bad meditator, or I'm not good at this. It's like, how do you, like, think about these things? I've been doing a course I'm calling Perennial Habits, where we just think about these things as just lifelong things. Um, but to your question, though, in terms of like love and things like that, and maybe seeing clearly, like, I don't know. Sometimes I think of the like solitude, the false self type of stuff. Some of these things of, like, getting some of that stuff out of the way, like, as you talk about, like, fear, guilt, shame type of stuff. How do we almost like clear the way a little bit to see some of that stuff? Like, in my experience, that type of seeing clearly, which I think Merton talks about it, because it connects with the uncertainty thing of, how do I, if you're getting feelings of fear, guilt, and shame, sometimes a wise question is like, how might I be wrong?
Mm.
Of well, what do I know? Something Montaigne type of said of, um to clear a little bit of that away, and maybe all of these things in a way work together, and all of these practices are interconnected in some sort of way.
Yeah, I've been playing with the metaphor. I don't know, I guess it's maybe even just the last month or so of because I loved, you talked about anchors, fill in the breeze, bring you back, or um I always think of, like, I even try to watch for birds and trees because I've mostly been oblivious, just thinking all the time with mostly my head down with my professor slouch walking around. So I try to look for things now, and look at leaves, listen, like you said. Um, and then obviously in centering prayer, my eyes closed. It's kind of the same thing. It's like you can get this when you get that centered presence for a split second or however long it lasts. I've been kind of liking it to, that's always available. And I think that's one of the benefits of contemplation is you get to see something that's actually true, that's always there, that we're oblivious to. And I think back, I mean, you're probably old enough to remember the old radios where you had to dial them with the dials. And I wonder if this kind of this contemplative signal, if you will, which I would call it's just God's love that's just always there. But we have to actually manually dial our radio in, and these practices let us to do that, so that more and more of our lives we can just be present. How does that kind of image land with you, with what you're trying to describe?
Yeah, it does. And in a way of, I tend to think in visuals a lot. So I like in the way of dialing in. Sometimes I think some of, like, a particular insight, you can think of, like, self-improvement, or growth and things like that. I wonder sometimes how helpful those words are
Hmm.
when I like reflect and think about something. If you get a particular insight, you're able to see something. Like, did you improve at all? Was that really some sort of growth? Or is that, you were able to catch something at a particular angle that you weren't able to see it before? Some sort of like the dial in the optometrist's office type of thing. It's like, something and that same thing. But I tend to think a lot in the way of seeing, like seeing clearly, what am I missing here? Like if all is well, and maybe it doesn't necessarily seem that way, what am I missing? What am I not seeing?
And so when you answer a question like that, and when you have kind of a contemplative moment of real clarity, how do you actually land that in your life in some tangible way? Is that where your stoic practices come in? Like, how do you integrate, like, let's say an insight, right? Because you're all right. I mean, we could have a great insight. You can type it and you might never forget it, but it may not do anything tangibly other than have just kind of astonished your mind for a couple seconds or whatever. But like, what have you found, and in what way has contemplation enhanced your ability to integrate insights?
Yeah. In a way, like this answer may not sit that well with like any listeners. And this is something Merton talks about as well. In a way, the question is the answer. Like, what am I not seeing? Like in that particular
Good.
moment, what am I not seeing? Like as the question, like that's enough. Maybe there, because I mean, what can you really know for sure in that particular situation? But even being open to the idea that there might be something that is like beyond my understanding in this moment, and that is completely okay. And I think sometimes when we have too much of a desire to fill in those dots or fill in the holes of what might be missing, well, maybe we're filling in, maybe we're answering things that are like more, I don't know how to say it exactly. Um,
Well, Merton talks about, and this, let me just, I don't want to put words in your
yeah, no,
mouth, but
please.
I love where you're going with this right now. But he has that little section in New Seeds, and I'd have to pull the book out to get the quote, but he talks about the more you do contemplate, I'm paraphrasing now, is that you find out that God is nothing, and you actually lose your experience. You lose who you thought God was. And the reality is that's true because God wasn't anything anyway. Is that kind of where you're going with that kind of idea, and that and so then you can be okay with that because you've had like an experience that then frees us from having to work out all the really specific details in a ways that ultimately would be, I would say, idolatrous, because sometimes the details we actually make God something other than God by to make it make sense in our own minds.
Yeah, it gets I I like that. And around like the faith thing and the doubt and losing, he speaks a bit about you're not necessarily losing like your actual faith,
Right, right.
like a bit of the doubt. It's to me it is more of you're accepting the unknowing type of stuff. um but he calls it in the way of like the doubt is like a false doubt, I think might be the term that he uses in front of that. But in a way of like we have all experienced and been like in the midst of turmoil. We're just in this day of where it doesn't all seem well, and we're bothered by um
Everything.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, you
People are
get
bothered by everything today, it seems
that.
like.
Yeah. And even just coming to that thing, like to stick with that question of, what am I not seeing? Some sort of reminder of like, if we're called to love, oh, I mean, even that of, if you think of like the Saint Francis prayer, which I think I brought up in previous conversations with you, but I'm fascinated by that middle pivot of where it basically shifts from inside to out. A lot of the turmoil, a lot of the things, and maybe the Stoics would talk about like desires and aversions, something a lot of the monks talk about, and desires, temptations, all of this type of stuff can cause this, inner turmoil. But really, all is well because we still have the agency to pardon others, to love others. It's still, in like we all need some sort of reminder, but it seems like, at least in my experience, the humility like switch or like flipping it type of thing of being, well, what do I exactly know? I'm not exactly um certain how the world is supposed to unfold, if you will, type of stuff.
I just want to jump right on the humility piece because I thought that was that's for when I was listening to you. I was one, and then you actually you said that. So one of the fruits of contemplation seems to be humility, and the interesting thing seems to be gets back the ability to embrace uncertainty. And is that how would you? I don't want to put words in your mouth. So does contemplation lead to humility because
Yeah.
we get put into a space of uncertainty? Or is that
Yeah.
part of it?
No, it reminds me of an interesting point around solitude.
Yeah.
He talks about being wary of solitude. If you think of the person that is maybe coming from the place of the false self, or you just think like coming from the place of this individualistic type of thing, and now we're in this space, maybe it leads to a spiritual narcissism. Maybe it leads to this feeling of self-improvement or self-growth type of thing. And I'm not exactly saying from that's not necessarily a thing, but in the way of being wary of that, um, like where are we entering into that from? Like, are we entering in from a perspective of the false self, or something else?
Yeah, and talk a little bit about when you're saying false self, how do you think Merton reads that? What would you say that means to Merton? And then maybe even, we're talking about humility, that's the opposite of pride. So now we're into the seven deadly sins stuff too. And any reflections on how false self, seven deadly sins fits in with contemplation, at least as you've read through Merton or maybe even experienced inside your own soul?
Yeah, I think mostly for me, what I think has been most helpful is this thing of the individual.
Mm-hmm.
Like as he writes about it in New Seeds, in this individualistic, thing of where we're filling our own desires, but then they talk about the ego and things like that, which doesn't necessarily connect so much with me. It has so many different meanings, I think, when you hear that. But even from the place of like the individual, of if we can come from a place which I think comes through Merton and many, many of some of these like wise writers, that we're not better than anyone. We're
Yeah.
not less than anyone. And like that thing you think of Merton or any sort of situation of where we can see that we love everyone and everything. And honestly, and I mean, some of this stuff depends on like what your definition of things like love is, what is love. But I think from a, definition of essentially like goodwill, I think we should all be able to say and experience that everyone is in love with us. They're not necessarily, people out there, especially that are operating from some sort of true self where they are wishing any sort of ill will, to others. I mean, obviously there's dark things and there's evil and all of that type of stuff. But in the way of, we are loved. And I think we can tap in and experience that.
No, I love that. I think it's I've noticed in my own life, as I've continued to grow, and I would say I've been humbled by the contemplation, in the sense that in certain moments just overwhelmed, and literally realized like I don't know anything. And it's when you get those kind of moments, I think they can be kind of scary too, because you feel like you're going to lose yourself at some point. But what ultimately ends up happening is I think love comes through, and I've heard you saying that, as kind of this underlying current. And I would throw two more words in there that I think is interesting, because and this is where it gets to be paradoxical. Jesus even said if you try to find your life, you lose it, and you get that kind of language. And it seems like it's that at some point in the contemplative pieces too. And I have to be careful because I'm not trying to pretend like I'm some great contemplator either. But I've just gotten glimpses of this. But it's like you feel completely loved, and then in the midst of the unknowing, and this is where it doesn't quite make sense. The only thing I could say is like you feel safe despite the fact that you're stripped away of certainty, but you still feel safe and you feel accepted. And then love flows through. So you get like this, I would say, this interesting place of, because you're safe, you can surrender even more to God, I would say. And then when you surrender, you experience even more acceptance. And when you feel acceptance by God at a base level, I mean, total acceptance, like all of us, not just the false image or whatever, or our ideal image, but the whole mess, the true self, the false self, the shadow, a whole thing, that you're fully accepted by God. That seems to kill the ego off, if at least partially. Again, nobody's going to proclaim I have no ego, because I surely know I still have one. But that experience of this being accepted, which I think comes in some of these moments, it allows you to be a little less egocentric. Just turn it down a little bit, and then what happens? Then you even realize how much more God loves you, and then that lets us, with no ego, you can be more loving. And I'm hearing you saying that, and because that is the end, right? You can actually see another soul, and you can just see them. Yeah. And apart from judgment, because you just realize you haven't been judged for who you are by a God that can look right through you, and you actually realize that happened in the contemplative stuff. Does that what do you think about that? And is that any of your experience? And
yeah, it definitely is, in the way of like the darkness of human nature, like in ourselves, in the way of just like these desires and aversions that we have. I made a note. I've been, for the last couple of weeks, I've been reading A Year with Thomas Merton, and I'd love to share at some point something in there where it's from his journals. But this thing of we've talked about humility, like in a way it's humility, like this acceptance of whatever it may be. And he says something along the lines in No Man is an Island, that it's like going down and exploring all of the ways that you're unlovable.
Mm.
On the other side, to realize that in spite of it all, you are loved. And a few years ago, there's something that like really stuck with me. One guest that I had on In Search of Wisdom talked about that same idea from the perspective of Zen. There's this thing of you're absolutely perfect the way you are. And there's a few things you could, work on. And it's if you hear something like that, picture yourself in a performance review, it's like, things are going well. And there's a few things, the second part, and I mean, this is just from an individual perspective of, in solitude with yourself, but that second part can feel like a slight. But just like Merton was talking about, it's such an opportunity for authentic love, because the love that just like appreciates all the great and wonderful things, that you may have done, is that, is that the love that we're called to? No, probably not. If it's like the narrow gate, if it's the difficult path, yeah, it's loving those ways that honestly we're not necessarily so lovable. We're a bit neurotic, and we're a bit, certain when we shouldn't be, and all sorts of stuff. But at the same time, we're loved in spite of all of that. Like, that is some deep place to really experience, I think, some inner peace in a way, some, being at home in the world type of stuff.
Yeah, I definitely want you to share that piece here in a minute. But I think I've probably shared this quote on your podcast, but it comes from the Paul Tillich. It's when he always talked about grace being the moment you accept the fact that you're unconditionally accepted, and I hear that, and then I always think I think at least one of these was in the Centering Prayer book that I wrote, but I've always found there's an irony, because obviously God's infinite and we're finite. And therefore, like everything you just said, you can be completely loved and still have things to work on. And it's paradox, but it makes sense, because it's like, but both of us wear glasses, and our glasses are really dirty. You can tell, but a lot of times, you think, hey, this is great. But then, if you think of God as the light and you hold your glasses up to the light, bam, now you see everything. But, and then, we were talking before we started recording it, just going to the beach this summer with family, and that other metaphor I always think of is, the life that God ultimately is calling us to is love. And to me, love is infinite also. I'm not going to claim that that's some deep theological truth that has to be in a doctrine somewhere, but I think it's infinite. And if God is infinite and God is love at the core, that to me makes love infinite. And so I'm going to spend all eternity becoming more loving. That doesn't mean I'm not loving now. But when you compare it to God, it'd be like if we go to the beach and you like tell your kids, hey, swim out to the horizon, or take a surfboard out to the horizon. They're never getting an inch closer the whole time. But if you turn your head around and look back to the beach, I did get somewhere. I'm completely loved. And there's some still things to work on. So I love that. Yeah, I'd love to hear the little piece from Merton that you wanted to share. So make sure we do that before we have time. We'll record a little bit longer here, but let's see where we can go with that. I'd love to hear it.
Let me just touch on a couple points. And like I say, I've been reading this the last couple of weeks just in preparation to kind of chat about Merton. But the last 10 years of his life, he explored many different wisdom traditions, was interested in Zen and Buddhism and a lot of different things. And sometimes people are a bit critical of him for that. But if you look in his journal, this was the one from yesterday. This was written May 16th, 1968.
And can you remind us what book are you reading from now too? It's actually Merton's journal. Is that what you just said?
Yeah, it's a year with Thomas Merton,
Oh, okay,
daily
okay.
meditations from his journal,
Okay, cool.
and they're real short. But there's a particular point here. Give me
Yeah,
just
yeah.
a moment to find because I don't want to read this whole thing.
And I'll just toss in here while Josh is looking for this that we'll have everything in the show notes, links to Merton's books and all of Josh's materials as well.
But anyway, like as I was mentioning, he explored many different wisdom traditions. But if you look at his journal, it's all for the love of God. I mean, it is all about love. And he says, I am the utter poverty of God. I am his emptiness, littleness, nothingness, lostness. When this is understood, my life is his freedom. The self emptying of God in me is the fullness of grace. A love for God that knows no reason because he is the fullness of grace. A love for God that knows no reason because he is a God, a love without measure, a love for God as personal. And towards the end of this particular entry, he puts a quote in there from the Bhagavad Gita. You know, he says, distinguish work as narcotic. This is being an operator and all that goes with it, from healthy and free work, but also consider the wrong need for non action. As the Gita says, do not let the fruit of action be your motive, and do not be attached to non action. In other words, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Work to please God alone. So I think it highlights, and I mean, there's many different journal entries that he has, um, you know, just highlighting what the project was about, like this, what I would call like search for God, search for wisdom, love, whatever you would want to say there. But in the one for today, just read a couple sentences of this humility. It says, yesterday I was bitter for a while, growling to myself, yes, we have the Holy Ghost all right, in a cage with his wings clipped. But later, during the gospel, the let not your heart be disturbed came through into my heart as if especially directed to me, and I remembered there was no need to be bitter or to worry or even to notice what appears to me to be senseless in our life here. So I just love and have an appreciation, and I think why he connects with so many people is this, you know, deep humility in a way, and maybe it's just an honesty
Mm-hmm.
about himself and to be able to see, you know, both sides you know, of many different, you know, situations in life.
I love that, and I want to bring this back to some of like your project here too, like because did were you interested? Did you because you mentioned you found Merton when you've known your wife for 20 years, so it's been 20 years, so you're in your 20s. Were you already interested in say Seneca and any of this perennial wisdom tradition at that point, or did you come to that piece after you'd like read Keating and Merton and such? And like,
No, I think I started, you know, around my late 20s, really reading a lot of leadership books.
okay,
So really interested in leadership. I spent my adult life in the military, which in a way is a little bit similar, not as extreme to a monk, but in the way of being in some sort of system where you're
true,
part of that system. You know, obedience is a thing. You do, you know, what is required. But then after kind of transitioning from leadership books is when I got into a lot of the Merton, Thomas Keating, and Richard Rohr
okay.
type of stuff, and then probably Stoics a bit later after that.
So do you think that's yeah? So you came to the more wider wisdom stuff after kind of through your Christian faith in a sense, and after you've done all the leadership training. That's so. Do you think? I'm just curious, like the contemplation helped you being probably helped you be curious, brought you, like, I guess we could call it epistemological humility, in the sense that you don't feel like you have to have it all figured out. So you can just listen without necessarily, not without judgment, but without feeling like you have to put everything in a box right off the bat. Um, how has stoicism helped your contemplation, and how has then contemplation helped your stoicism? Maybe if that's
Yeah,
or interest in stuff. And let's just say Seneca, since I know you said that's your second favorite. You're Merton and Seneca are your two main
yeah, I do,
influences.
and I find a lot of similarities. I do a Sundays with Seneca, and thought about doing a Mondays with Merton. I'm sure I will at some point in time. But I think from a wisdom tradition standpoint, like, I'm a practicing Christian myself. I consider that my wisdom tradition.
Yes.
But I do think, as some of these other people have, talked about previously, that exploring some of these different traditions can help clarify, just like it did in that particular journal entry where he, integrated a line from the Bhagavad Gita. There are some of these things that maybe just written in a slightly different way, kind of same message, but from a 10-degree different angle, can really create some clarity around, what it means. For example, we did an episode, you connected and chatted with me for an hour about forgiveness.
Yeah.
Which it's Christianity. It's an unbelievable wisdom tradition, especially like around forgiveness. Like, there's just some beautiful things, like these parables and the passages, like, around forgiveness. But some of these Stoic practices can help us to actually practice forgiveness as well. Like, for the example, like the dichotomy of control, of knowing, what's up to us and what's not up to us. In a way, it's a similar thing as that St. Francis prayer, just put in a different thing. It's that second half. Actually, you're, called to pardon, to love, to this. I mean, it's the same way. It connects a little bit with that dichotomy of control. What's up to us? It's our own actions, our own doing is what's up to us. And it's a reminder to focus on that. So that's like a little example that comes to mind. But I think if you have a foundation and you have clarity around your particular wisdom tradition, if that's Christianity, for example, then some of these other wisdom traditions can just help, like, add to it, or, provide a particular practice to be a better fill in the blank, type of wisdom tradition that you're striving to follow.
No, I wholeheartedly agree. I actually, I think other things you can read. You can read the Tao. You can read. Well, you mentioned I don't even know how to say it, Bhagavad Gita, or however. I should know how to say it, but I don't. Or you could. But these traditions, these are deep. There's deep wisdom in all these things, and they sort of amplify. It doesn't wishy-washy your own position. It can amplify them. And I think the Stoic, they were really dialed in on at least one part of life, which was actually putting into practice the things that you said you believed. And that's what I personally appreciate the most of the Stoics. And I think that's why their writings were preserved in monasteries, because it's almost like Stoicism. Again, I have to be careful how I say this. So I'm not going to overstate this, but I'm just going to say it what was on my head. It's almost like it gives you an operating system that you can take the deep theological truths of Christianity and figure out how to actually integrate them and live them out. Like, I was at the beach for my birthday a couple of weeks ago, and I was reading Epictetus. And whenever I need a good, I always call it a good butt kicking, I read a little Epictetus, because I just feel like just cuts me to pieces. And the one quote that I came away with this time, it's from Discourses. It was something like, "Be happy when the doctrines you've been studying are put into practice in your real life. And that's the exact opposite. It's like, man, I just rather think about theology and never have to be tested at it. But I mean, and I think that's where Stoicism and even some of these other wisdom traditions, you get to see people talking about ways to actually embody things. It's one thing to say, I love everybody. It's another thing to actually love a person standing right in front of you that's annoying you right now, right? It's, I mean, so that's that's what draws me to the Stoics. I mean, what is that your similar experience? Like, would you, how would you respond to what I said?
Yeah, it definitely is. Like something as you were talking about there, something that always connects with me in the way of Seneca, and I think many of the Stoics, but Seneca like really hammers it home in these letters to Lucilius of, you know, virtue is the only good. It's really so much about clarity. You know, it's like the wise person, they may not take the same steps, but they walk a single road. And like, you know, as a Christian, it's like, you know, that road is love. You know,
Yes.
it's and that can help us like remembering like that is the only good. You know, it's like love of God, love of our neighbor, love of ourselves, you know, having some clarity and a reminder. Yeah, we might veer off, unfortunately, because we're sinners and we make mistakes and we may, you know, get off for a moment, but that's our road. We can come back to that single road, whatever that is for you as an individual, you know, create that clarity for you. But and I mean that's so much in that last passage of Merton. Then it's like, oh, then he's reminded, you know, he notices himself essentially veering off that road, you know, and then like coming back. And if we can, I think it's not always helpful for everyone, but you know, visualize in a way as like, you know, what that road looks like. It helps for me in terms of visualizing. I can notice, oh, I just veered, I just veered off the road here. How do I
Not so
get back on?
That's so good. That is good. And that's the contemplative thing that we just go back to your walking practice or a centering prayer. And that's that little moment when you adjust and realize you've broken presence. That actually, I would say that teaches us the very, you're talking about repentance, basically, noticing, getting back on the road, noticing, getting back on the road. And it hits all parts of our lives. Now, so this is good. Um, Again, I want to be fair to your time here. I think I could go on. I really appreciate this, and we're gonna have to do this again, actually, because we've approached the depths here a little bit. So we'll come back on again here at some point. Somebody's listening and maybe doesn't know a lot about Merton. You've mentioned a few books. Like, where do you, when you introduce a person to Thomas Merton, which of his books do you suggest people maybe jump into or open up and start working through?
I tend to say New Seeds of Contemplation.
Yeah.
It's a short book. The chapters are really short. I want to say there's like, you know, 30 chapters or something like that in there. But yeah, I think you can't go wrong with that.
And then, and you've mentioned, what are some of your other favorite Merton books? You've mentioned a couple things on there. I just want to make sure I record everything. Like what else have you read that you found really helpful or interesting, or maybe just something you thought, wow, that's just a really cool book.
Yeah, I want to say some of these journal entries. Signs of Jonas is a book of his journal entries. I also like this, you know, the year with Merton, if somebody maybe finds interest in something, but maybe before you get anything, you can easily do some Google searching around and, you know, check out some of his stuff. But I think there's a lot there, and even if it doesn't connect initially, like in that term seeds, like the original book Seeds of Contemplation and New Seeds of Contemplation, you know, he talks about each moment. It's basically some of these seeds just fly away and perish, but I think it's something you can come back to, again and again. To me, it's something you could read once a year, and 5 years later, or 3 months later, plants these little seeds that might start to connect and grow, if you will.
That's good. That's really good. Just curious, have you ever had the opportunity to go to Gethsemane in Kentucky where Merton lived?
No, I've thought about it because I don't live super far from there. I actually had on my podcast someone that is there and was there at the same time as Merton and stuff like that. But it's definitely something I want to do at some point in time, for sure.
Okay, I was just curious. I know there's one closer to in Georgia, Conyers. It's the same. There's a what the I forget what to call it, the something to the Holy Spirit, I think it is. There's another Cistercian community, I think it is. That's right there too. That's a little
Yeah.
closer, but that's not the. But I know Merton. You can go and check out his little hermitage that he had. I've known a couple people that have gone there, so it's good. No, this
Nice.
is this has been a great conversation, Josh. I appreciate you coming on. Would you share with folks where the best place to find you and talk about some of the work that you're doing in your podcast, and even like you mentioned the Sundays with Seneca? Talk to folks how they can connect with you if they would be interested and be part of some of these bigger conversations that you're having with the world.
Oh, sure. I appreciate that. I'm retired from the military, so first and foremost, I drop my kids off from school and pick them up, and take care of stuff around the house here. But in between that, I do what I call like a daily email meditation newsletter on Substack. It's called Perennial Meditations. Um, and there you can it covers all sorts of stuff from various different traditions, from Sundays with Seneca, and right now every Monday I'm doing the art of living from Socrates to St. Thomas Aquinas, where each week I'm exploring a bit of the life and philosophy of some of these great Stoic saints and sages. So a lot of different stuff on there, but probably Perennial Meditations on Substack is the best spot. And one other thing is every Friday we do this weekly meetup, which is kind of part of this daily email thing. But every Friday at noon Eastern, we run this book club, and we have been doing it for about 6 months now. But we started with New Seeds of Contemplation. Right now, we're talking about Spinoza, but we're covering various different thinkers from different traditions and things like that. And it's just a space to connect. It's a small group from ages from probably my age to 70s, to connect and have conversations on the art of living, really.
That's a beautiful life. Again, I mean, I'm grateful that the military gives good retirements, because that's it's almost like you have a professor's life going on there. And I do want to recommend Josh's newsletter, and at minimum connect with him on Instagram. I think you're on Twitter also, but just continuously pours out good posts, and you can just see some of the great quotations from the Western world. And his writing is deep, and again, super grateful for the work that you're doing.
Well, I appreciate it. I definitely appreciate it, and I feel unbelievably fortunate to have the space and the time, and really I'm coming at it from a very average, everyday, navigating life perspective. And hopefully that comes through a bit in the writing of what might be useful in daily life.
No, it absolutely does. And I'd go so far, if anyone's listening and people are looking for ways to help, like I would feel completely comfortable and suggest that you could let teenagers and kids in high school, maybe a little bit younger, but at least definitely high school kids that are looking to expand intellectually, kids in college. Josh's stuff is outstanding at a certain age, to just help introduce you to wisdom. Because as part of this work of, I would say, rebuilding the West, let alone reintroducing Christianity. We need really good thinkers that can deal with the complexity. And again, I find your writing just to be outstanding. I know you're being humble here, but I definitely want to say anybody, like I would say homeschool networks, other things, can connect with Josh's stuff and find some really good resources that bring primary texts into conversation with 2023. And that, I think that's your real gift, honestly. And I'm grateful for it.
Well, I appreciate that. It means a lot. Yeah. Thanks so much, Brian.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah. And everyone, thanks for listening to this week's edition of the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. If you found this episode helpful, please consider sharing it with your friends. And until next time, live by faith, be known by love, and be voices of hope in the world.